I will introduce Mike Phillips, bring him up here to the stage. Mike is a lead with the Avalanche and Weather program at Mammoth Mountain, and he's joining us today to offer an operations perspective on avalanche safety.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out to support ESAC. And who? I got a tech advisor here. Awesome. It's become a little bit of a tradition here with the annual fundraiser and the ESAC workshops to have some representation of avalanche workers that are in the area that maybe have a little bit of a different take on what exactly we do as avalanche workers in a variety of contexts, whether it's ski guiding or working as a ski patroller. And the Mammoth Mountain Ski Patrol really supports ESAC. We do so by submitting our observations to them. We have a direct communication with the forecasters to share what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. Because often we're the first ones out after big snow, big storm events, first ones touching the snow for the day here in the Eastern Sierra. And we can reach out to these guys early in the day and let them know what we're seeing out there. Sometimes beautiful sunrises and deep snow, sometimes just carnage from big snow events at high elevations. And some days are just better than others, scenic and soft and a sense of solitude. And believe it or not, more often than not, it's not just awesome powder skiing as a ski patroller. It's a lot of brutal survival skiing first thing in the morning. And what's nice about that experience is that, especially with the team here at ESAC, we can all relate. Having worked as ski patrollers, working with Everett directly, Clancy having been on the Mammoth Mountain Ski Patrol, and Steve having experience patrolling and doing snow safety work elsewhere. We share a common language and really just value the professional relationships that we have here in the Eastern Sierra, communicating with local ski guides, avalanche educators, the forecasters, the patrollers. It's all really good stuff. I want to highlight a little bit and maybe give a bit of a disclaimer about this presentation, in that really we're talking about two different worlds here. My presentation about snow safety and avalanches at the ski area is completely different than what you're seeing out in the backcountry. We work with a fundamentally different snowpack than what you see in the backcountry. And we try to make it really clear to our guests up at the ski area when it is that they're stepping outside of the ski area, because that's an important differentiation to have, that once you leave the ski area boundary, which is indicated by the sign on the right, things change, and you need to go out there with an open mind as to what the conditions might be like, be more self-reliant, have a plan, and really approach anything that's even just outside of the ski area boundary as really being in the backcountry. As soon as you leave that line, things are a lot different. And we try to communicate those hazards to people the best we can, but we rely on ESAC and the forecasters to help get the word out about conditions that are just outside of our boundary. And we also lean on that forecast ourselves for when we're performing search and rescue operations outside of the ski area, because the snowpack is different, and we need to know what's going on with the different avalanche problems that are outside of the ski area. you know, some of the things that make our snowpack different than what you might find out in the backcountry is that we have a ton of skier traffic, right? So here's the frenzy top of Lincoln Mountain on a POW day, people just sprinting to get into the avalanche terrain, a little bit of a different approach than how people might get into the backcountry. But we do our best to open avalanche terrain as quickly as possible because we get it. Everybody wants to be able to ski in the steep terrain in a more controlled environment. And it also helps us to keep up on the avalanche problems by knocking down that new snow and keeping those slabs from developing in particular. So we need you to get into the terrain. We want you to go out there and ski. It's really important to us. But we do have thresholds as far as when we can do it and how we approach opening that terrain. So we ask that people be patient and understand that it takes time. And we have our own risk tolerances as far as when we're comfortable with opening terrain, what sort of uncertainty we're willing to accept to get people into it. But in the end, it really helps us out. So keep coming up there, get into the terrain. And honestly, that's one of the great things about being able to ski and ride in a place like Mammoth is that you can be in the weather. You can be out when the conditions in the backcountry would be at the peak of their instability. And people who are informed users, it's a good chance to be in steep terrain, to be in bona fide avalanche terrain and watch how new snow is being deposited, watch how the snow is blowing around, and get a feel for what avalanche terrain is like in pretty full-on conditions without necessarily having to expose yourself to the hazards of being out in the backcountry. Now, another big difference in the approach that we have at the ski area and what makes the snowpack different is that we're doing frequent avalanche mitigation work, right? We're out there trying to cause the avalanches before people get into it. And that comes with a little bit of a different mindset for us. We are truly avalanche mitigators, avalanche hunters. We're out there looking for the problem, trying to make it happen, testing our hypothesis or testing our forecast to see if the instability is actually there. And we're using tools to test that, but also to try and make it happen, which is a little bit of a different approach than maybe your approach in the backcountry, where maybe you're using small pieces of avalanche terrain to test the forecast, to see if you can find that in-storm instability. But you're using slopes that are pretty low consequence, right, to be able to find that instability and minimize your exposure to the avalanche problem. Whereas we're intentionally putting ourselves into the terrain. We're throwing explosives, we're protecting ourselves with those. We're using our skis to cause smaller avalanches. And we can do that thanks to our familiarity with the terrain. We can use it because we have a well-organized rescue team on standby and lots of training and understanding how the problems typically present themselves in the terrain. So our real goal, you know, is to keep up on things and cause lots of small avalanches throughout the season, during the peak of the instability, during the storms, make these smaller slides happen, and avoiding some of these larger, more catastrophic avalanches, both for a public safety standpoint to keep our guests and to keep the users safe from being exposed to the avalanche problem, but also protecting our infrastructure. We have lots of buildings and chairlifts and stuff that are exposed to avalanche danger. And we really want to keep up on that stuff to keep it from being damaging to our chairlifts and our buildings and our employees moving around. Mammoth is a pretty spectacular place, I've got to say, to be an avalanche worker. It's what they would call a Class A avalanche area, which really what that means is that we have lots of big avalanche terrain. And in order to operate in a safe manner in a commercial sense, we need a very active avalanche mitigation program. There are no chairlifts at Mammoth Mountain that don't directly access avalanche terrain or exposed to avalanche terrain, which is really interesting. Even the beginner chairs, you can get yourself into some terrain where you're either tiptoeing into the avalanche terrain or you're exposed to it from above. So it's kind of it's an interesting place in that sense. It takes a lot of management of the crowds and keeping people out of certain areas in order to keep them safe. We also perform avalanche mitigation work on the Lake Mary Road. So this might look familiar to some of the locals who spend any time up in the Lakes Basin. We can access the top of these avalanche paths that are over the Lake Mary Road just below Twin Lakes and do some control work there to keep that road open. It's one of the few spots in the Eastern Sierra where there are roads that are affected by avalanche paths that have an active mitigation program. So we are doing that throughout the winter. We have a big team of patrollers who work at Mammoth, and all of us are involved in doing avalanche mitigation work. So from day one of somebody's career at Mammoth, they are expected to be an active participant in our avalanche control program, which helps to build a really experienced crew over time. And we have a lot of great up and coming people. We have a lot of great mentors with a ton of experience on the patrol. And we're just really lucky to get the frequency of storms that we do to keep people involved and keep us all sharp and professional. I think it's worth a little bit of storytelling about avalanche mitigation in general. And one thing I want to highlight is that really snow science and avalanche work in general is a relatively young science, right? This is a photo of Monty Atwater, one of the original snow rangers for the US Forest Service, who was hired to help to protect Little Cottonwood Canyon and Alta ski area. And his work is really less than 100 years old. He started working in Alta and Little Cottonwood Canyon in the 1940s and was right away a pretty cutting edge and intelligent person when it came to the snow and avalanche world, and brought a lot of techniques and tools that are still in use today. He was the first person to bring the idea of using military artillery to helping to control avalanches in exposed areas. And he picked up these ideas from being a soldier in World War I, where the Swiss in particular were using artillery to fire onto avalanche-prone slopes to cause slides to happen, to come down on enemy troops or block passage, or protect the ability of the troops to be able to move around. So he not only brought the idea of using artillery, but also explosives in general, hand-placed explosives, to cause avalanches to happen, to keep up on the problem so that you don't have lingering issues. Historically, Mammoth has not been immune to avalanche accidents. This is a photo from 1968 of an avalanche that occurred in what is now known as Scotty's. Scotty was a skier that was killed in an avalanche there. You can imagine back in the 1960s with less knowledge of snow science, more limited resources, and no artillery at this time. Without the skier traffic and without the heavy explosives use, Mammoth was a pretty real and intimidating place. And this was a large avalanche that occurred late in the day after a prolonged storm cycle, with some mitigation efforts taken. But this group of skiers skied the same slope twice, the second time triggering a large avalanche that buried Scotty and ultimately killed him. This is one of the early snow rangers at Mammoth facilitating the rescue there. And this really, helped to highlight the need for a active avalanche program at Mammoth. Typically way back, one of the sort of approaches that most people used in the avalanche prone mountains was just to wait several days after big snowfall to get into avalanche terrain. And that happened at Mammoth too, that people weren't allowed to access the upper mountain immediately following storm cycles. But once we had the gondola installed to the top of the mountain, you can imagine it's hard to keep people from wanting to get into the bigger terrain. So these were the days of using hand-placed explosives only, and some ski cutting, some sort of testing of the slopes using skis to see if patrollers could trigger avalanches. But a small team and a smaller number of skiers that were getting into the terrain. So that's the result of that, is potential tragedies like that. Another thing that Monty Atwater brought that's a piece of Mammoth history is the invention of the Avalancher, which is really just a glorified potato gun to launch explosives from a distance onto slopes, which help to minimize worker exposure to avalanche slopes and be able to deliver these charges remotely. So he developed that in Alta and ultimately ended up bringing one of the early avalanchers to Mammoth. So here he is working with Dave McCoy and one of the early avalanchers here at Mammoth, which helped us to kind of expand the control program, be able to access that terrain a little bit more easily without exposing people. And it started to help us to understand the benefit of these more remote systems. We moved on to bring in artillery to Mammoth in the 1970s, thanks to an affiliation with the Forest Service. Early artillery was definitely for the tougher people out there to be out in the open shooting these guns, sometimes during big storms. And because we were able to get into the terrain more quickly and safely with explosives, we were able to trigger some of these bigger slides shortly after storm events rather than waiting to put people into it. And before we had the ability to fire weapons during storms, this went against our approach now of creating many small avalanches versus big ones, is that we have a record of large avalanches that occurred shortly after storms because we simply weren't able to keep up with the snowfall during the storm events. So this is pre-blind fire, pre-being able to do any mitigation work during storms on the upper mountain. It's really big, impressive avalanches. That's one of the biggest advantages of having this military artillery and the skills to use it is we can continually keep up with controlling the upper mountain, the large avalanche paths. This is pretty typical for us to be just shooting into a cloud and sometimes 100 miles an hour wind right in your face, is that we have known targets. The weapon is quite advanced in its ability to dial in the position of the gun to be able to hit these targets from a distance during these big storms. And then once we have more confidence in the snowpack, once we have the visibility, we do get into the upper mountain avalanche paths and use explosives. So this is what you're hearing banging off early in the morning. When it's back to back to back, it's us using dynamite on the snow. We can keep up on the lower mountain during storms, but it often takes a solid clearing for us to get into the bigger terrain for safety reasons and to be a little bit more precise with the placement of these shots. the bombs are really quite effective, especially with dealing with surface instabilities. So us in the paranoids. It's such an awesome opportunity as somebody who really loves the snow and is fascinated by avalanches to be standing that close and have that relative safety of using the explosives rather than putting myself into the terrain in the backcountry. And, you know, we try to keep up, like I said, lots of small avalanches versus large events. But once in a while, we do get surprised. And this was a couple of years ago. After firing the artillery and putting a single stick of dynamite in a place that cannot get an artillery round, this might be a little bit deceptive here, just video quality, but you can see an obvious powder cloud, and it may not have looked like the biggest, most intimidating avalanche. But once we got into it, we could take a step in and see the size of these crowns and talk about spatial variability here. The fact that we could shoot this high payload of explosives with the gun, not get any results in that area, and then 1-2 pound stick of dynamite triggers an avalanche that looks like this. And I'll borrow a saying that I heard from a respected pro in the Wasatch, who I once heard him say that you, as an avalanche worker, you should always be surprised if you're not surprised. And I've seen that manifest a couple times in my career at Mammoth, that late in the season, keeping up with avalanche problems throughout the season, with a persistent weak layer present in the snowpack that's been skied on for months. We've still forecast for these problems. We keep it in the front of our mind to help keep our uncertainty in check. But there are times when we're surprised at the work that can, at the results that can happen later in the season. Steve had that great photo of the slide in the paranoids last year after a month of shooting it and skiing it, and eventually these huge avalanches can happen. This was a massive crown across Climax and Upper Dry. So one of the ways that we help to manage our uncertainty and manage our risk is by building in as much margin for error as we can to help pad our margins, to give us enough space to feel confident about the terrain that we're letting people get into. So that one of our best risk management tools that we have, and the first step in our mitigation program, an avalanche safety program, is just to restrict access to certain areas. And we sign these, we rope them in most places, but what's really helpful for us is for people to not just respect these closures so that we can get the work done in a safe manner, but also help to police them as locals and people that are informed. We ask that people step up and really hold the others accountable. We get it, powder fever happens, but we need your help to keep these areas safe and keep the less informed people out of them. Because it is like lemmings. As soon as one person ducks a rope, it's just a cascade of problems for us. And then we end up having to limit the terrain even further, which is definitely not what we want to do. So, you know, a lot of this is not to say that our job is just to carpet bomb the mountain and just throw a bomb at everything that we see and to make it slide. It is a bit more of a calculated approach that isn't necessarily in the front of people's minds. We follow a similar process to any avalanche forecasting center. We track the season's conditions. We monitor those changes over time. We write an avalanche forecast that helps to keep our workers safe. And we support that forecast and our communication with the public and within our team with actual field observations, both of the changing snowpack and current conditions. So right here, this would be one of those mornings that you know things are about to get real when your snowboards and your sensors that you see the new snowfall on are getting buried by 4 in the morning. When you're seeing close to 6 feet of snow fall in a 24-hour period, you know that things are about to get pretty exciting when you're going out to do the avalanche work. One of the great resources that we have and an opportunity for us to interface with the public is the Mammoth Mountain Patrol website. And we're one of the most instrumented remote stations in the country. We have lots of wind information scattered about the mountain in particular, as well as our snow study site where you can see how much snow is falling and see what kind of snow is on the ground. Also figure out how much water is falling in certain storms. And this is a free access to anybody who's out there. And I encourage you all to use this as a reliable source for weather information here in the Eastern Sierra. And there's also good access to weather forecasts for the area as well. So to go back to, what happens outside of the ski area is completely different to what happens inside the ski area. And maybe just a quick anecdote about one of the events in my career that really highlighted that things are different outside the ski area and that things aren't always going to happen the way you expect them to. This is an avalanche path outside of the ski area called Fresno Bowl. It's southwest facing off the backside of Mammoth Mountain. It's certainly steep enough to avalanche, to borrow a saying from a colleague of mine who looked at this and was not as surprised as most and said that, well, yeah, any slope that can slide will slide given the right conditions. This was one of those days where on the ski area, we just weren't getting a ton of results with our explosives and our ski cutting. It was after a couple inches of rain to the summit of the mountain, rain on snow event, high elevation. With our snowpack, we were really kind of on high alert for big results in the ski area. And we weren't getting what we expected. And then off the backside of the mountain on sweep, one of our rookie ski patrollers spotted evidence of this crown and reported this observation to the patrol management. And we had no idea to what extent this avalanche had happened. And it was one of those ones that caught even the most experienced and knowledgeable people on our staff off guard. That we've seen small avalanches in Fresno Bowl before, but certainly never anything that looked like this. So it goes to show that, mileage and experience can go a long way. Anybody can contribute information that is valuable to the team, and things are changing. And to embrace that idea that you should be surprised if you're not surprised. And this is certainly one of those that in some people's 40-year careers, they had never seen an avalanche like this. And maybe we're never going to see one like this again, but just to be alert to changing conditions and, expect to be surprised out there. This was kind of 2 different paths that were triggered by the same event, huge wet slab, and kind of a geologic event in a lot of ways, the scouring of the pumice and the creation of this canyon in a couple spots. And, that kind of brings me to some parting thoughts about experience with working with avalanches, working in the snow world, whether you're a backcountry skier, a guide, an educator, a avalanche worker. It's really important to find those people that have lots of experience, to listen to the stories that they have to tell, to not necessarily become overly reliant on just the data, and to really listen to people's intuition out there about what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and how things are changing. And hopefully we become those people for other folks as you continue to mature in your backcountry career or your professional career. Just remember to listen to those folks when they point out what are exceptional conditions in their experience, and start to pay attention to those significant events in your life, because education and personal travel can go a long way, but connecting with other people in the mountains is an awesome way to learn and to grow. And hopefully we can all build a team that fosters that we can have a good time together out in the mountains. We can teach each other, and just remember, for most of us, it all starts with the skiing and ends with the skiing, and it's up to us to keep ourselves safe so that we can continue to ski powder in the steep mountains and share that experience with other people out there. I'm happy to answer any questions about our program and any thoughts on experience out there. You drive.
Well, thank you, Mike. We certainly appreciate all the obs you provide and the work you do up on the hill. Any questions here in the room?
Yeah, it is a conversation that we're having, and it's a trend in the industry to use more of these remote systems. We have found that the artillery is a really powerful tool, and we're resistant to give that up at this time, because it has proven to be, we have such an awesome safety record with it. It's proven to be effective, but it is happening all over the country where programs that previously relied on artillery are taking a step away from it and using more of these remote systems. There's a few scattered about the Eastern Sierra. As you go into June Lake on Mount Downs, there's some GASX infrastructure there. Above the community of Lee Vining and Highway 395, there's some GASX exploders that they can use remotely. And there's a lot of benefits to those remote systems. And I would expect that way down the line, that is going to become more the norm rather than the systems that we're using now. Cool. Thank you, guys.